Known for its relentless and unforgiving terrain, the Battle of the Kokoda Trail is often dubbed the Stalingrad of the Pacific. This critical campaign in the Pacific theater of World War II was a brutal clash between Japanese and Australian forces in the dense jungles of Papua New Guinea. In 1942, the Japanese High Command, under the leadership of General Tomitaro Horii, launched a bold offensive aimed at capturing Port Moresby via the rugged Kokoda Trail. This strategic move was part of their broader plan to isolate Australia and cut off Allied supply lines in the Pacific. The Japanese were determined to seize control of Papua New Guinea, which would provide them a staging ground for further advances towards Australia. Standing in their way were the battle-hardened and resilient soldiers of the Australian 39th Battalion, later reinforced by the 7th Division. These troops faced an overwhelming and determined Japanese force in a desperate and grueling struggle that would ultimately decide the fate of the Pacific region. The unforgiving terrain and harsh environment of the Kokoda Trail meant that any military engagement was not just a battle against the enemy, but also a struggle for survival against nature itself. Stretching approximately 96 kilometers through the heart of Papua New Guinea's Owen Stanley Range, the Kokoda Trail posed immense geographic challenges to both Japanese and Australian forces. This narrow, winding path traverses dense tropical jungle, marked by towering trees, thick underbrush, and fast-flowing rivers that often swell during torrential rainfalls. The trail itself was a muddy, slippery track, which became a quagmire during the frequent downpours, making movement slow and treacherous. The steep mountains along the trail required soldiers to navigate sharp ascents and descents, often with inclines exceeding 45 degrees. These mountains also created a natural barrier that limited visibility and made it difficult to establish strong supply lines or communication networks. The extreme weather conditions, ranging from oppressive heat and humidity during the day to chilling cold at night, compounded the physical strain on the troops. Additionally, the risk of tropical diseases such as malaria and dysentery was ever present. In early 1942, following their rapid conquests across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the Japanese High Command formulated a plan to capture Port Moresby, the capital of Papua New Guinea. Seizing Port Moresby was critical for the Japanese, as it would provide a strategic base to launch further operations aimed at isolating Australia from the United States and its other allies. This move would disrupt Allied supply lines and communications, weakening their ability to mount a coordinated defense in the Pacific. The Japanese strategy involved a two-pronged approach, an overland assault via the Kokoda Trail and an amphibious landing. The overland route was seen as essential because the amphibious approach had been thwarted by Allied forces at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. General Tomitaro Horii led the South Seas Detachment on this treacherous journey through the jungle-clad mountains, aiming to strike at the heart of the Allied defenses from an unexpected direction. The broader implications of capturing Port Moresby were significant. It would give the Japanese control over the airfields, allowing them to launch air raids on northern Australia, disrupt Allied shipping lanes, and potentially force Australia into a defensive position, thereby altering the balance of power in the Pacific. For the Allies, particularly Australia, the Kokoda Trail held immense strategic importance. The fall of Port Moresby to Japanese forces would have left Australia exposed to devastating air raids and the real threat of an invasion. Recognizing this threat, the Allied High Command under General Douglas MacArthur and Australian General Sir Thomas Blamey prioritized the defense of the trail to prevent the Japanese from gaining a foothold on the southern coast of Papua New Guinea. The initial defense was undertaken by the Australian 39th Battalion, a militia unit composed largely of young, inexperienced soldiers. Despite their lack of formal training and proper equipment, these soldiers demonstrated remarkable resilience and determination to hold their ground against the advancing Japanese forces. Their task was to delay the Japanese long enough for reinforcements from the Australian 7th Division, seasoned veterans from the Middle East campaigns, to arrive. The strategic significance of the Kokoda Trail lay not only in its direct protection of Port Moresby, but also in its symbolic importance. At this stage of the war, the Japanese land forces had not been beaten, and their rapid advance south did not look like it could be stopped. A successful defense would boost Allied morale and demonstrate that Japanese advances could be halted and reversed. It was a battle not just for territory, but for the control of the entire Southwest Pacific, making every skirmish along the trail a crucial part of the larger war effort. In July 1942, the Japanese forces began their advance along the Kokoda Trail. Their initial objective was to capture the village of Kokoda, a critical staging point for further assaults toward Port Moresby. The first significant clash occurred on July 23rd, when Japanese forces encountered the Australian 39th Battalion near Awala. Despite being outnumbered and lacking heavy weaponry, the Australians utilized guerrilla tactics, leveraging their intimate knowledge of the dense jungle to ambush the Japanese, slowing their advance with hit-and-run attacks. One of the key engagements in these early clashes was the Battle of Deneki, where the Australians executed a surprise counterattack that temporarily pushed the Japanese back, demonstrating their determination and tactical ingenuity. However, the Japanese, who had initially underestimated the Australians' resolve, quickly regrouped and launched a series of relentless assaults, forcing the Australians to retreat further along the trail. These initial skirmishes set the tone for the campaign, characterized by brutal hand-to-hand combat and close-quarter fighting in the unforgiving jungle. The Australians' ability to inflict significant casualties and disrupt Japanese plans through guerrilla tactics proved crucial in buying time for reinforcements to arrive and prepare for the larger battles to come. The 39th Battalion, comprising largely of young and inexperienced militia from Victoria, Australia, became the linchpin of the early Australian defence along the Kokoda Trail. Despite their lack of training and adequate equipment, these soldiers displayed remarkable bravery and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. Their role in the campaign was pivotal, particularly in the initial stages where their actions delayed the Japanese advance and provided valuable time for the arrival of reinforcements. Led by Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honor, the 39th Battalion soldiers were often outnumbered and outgunned, leading to some of the most desperate and vicious fighting encountered by Australian troops in the Second World War, yet they held their ground. At the Battle of Isurava, their determination reached legendary status. Positioned at a critical choke point on the trail, the 39th Battalion, alongside elements of the 2nd 14th Battalion, faced repeated and ferocious attacks from the Japanese. Despite suffering heavy casualties and being pushed to their limits, they managed to inflict severe losses on the Japanese forces. The heroic actions of individuals like Private Bruce Kingsbury, who charged a Japanese machine gun post, significantly boosted the morale of the Australian troops and exemplified the courage that became synonymous with the 39th Battalion. Despite the fierce resistance from the Australian forces, the Japanese initially made significant advancements along the Kokoda Trail. Their disciplined and experienced soldiers, well-versed in jungle warfare, managed to push deeper into the rugged terrain, capitalizing on their superior numbers and aggressive tactics. By mid-August, the Japanese had captured the vital village of Kokoda, forcing the Australians to retreat further along the trail. The momentum gained by the Japanese was driven by their strategic objective to quickly reach and capture Port Moresby. Under the command of General Tomitaro Horii, the Japanese forces pressed forward relentlessly, overcoming the natural obstacles and the stubborn Australian defence. Their advance was marked by a series of brutal engagements, including the battles at Deneki, Alola and Eora Creek, where they inflicted significant casualties on the Australian defenders. However, the Japanese advancements came at a high cost. The harsh terrain, combined with supply line difficulties and the Australians' guerrilla tactics, began to strain their resources and morale. The relentless pace of their offensive, coupled with the Australians' dogged resistance, meant that every gain was hard-fought and costly. Despite these challenges, the Japanese forces remained determined to achieve their objective, pushing the campaign into a critical phase as they neared the key defensive positions held by the Australians. As the Japanese forces pushed deeper into the heart of Papua New Guinea, both sides braced for a decisive confrontation at Isurava, a critical choke point along the Kokoda Trail. The Australians, now bolstered by reinforcements from the 2nd 14th Battalion, prepared to make a stand alongside the battle-weary 39th Battalion. The soldiers fortified their positions, constructing makeshift defenses amid the dense jungle foliage, knowing that they had to hold this line to prevent the Japanese from advancing towards Port Moresby. The Japanese were equally determined. Their forces had endured grueling conditions and fierce resistance, but capturing Isurava was essential for maintaining their momentum. They readied themselves for a full-scale assault, bringing up artillery and reinforcing their ranks with fresh troops. Both sides understood the significance of this battle. The stage was set for a brutal and decisive clash. On August 26, 1942, the Battle of Isurava erupted with ferocious intensity. The Japanese launched a series of relentless assaults aiming to break through the Australian defences. The dense jungle transformed the battlefield into a chaotic and close-quarters combat zone where visibility was limited and every inch of ground was fiercely contested. Both sides endured heavy casualties. The Australians, despite being outnumbered, used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to mount a staunch defense, engaging in hand-to-hand combat and using guerrilla tactics to ambush the advancing Japanese. The sound of gunfire, explosions, and battle cries echoed through the jungle as the fighting raged day and night. The Japanese soldiers, seasoned and disciplined, pressed their attacks with unwavering determination. They exploited every weakness in the Australian lines, but the defenders' resilience and strategic use of the terrain slowed their progress. The battle became a brutal test of endurance and willpower, with neither side willing to concede. Amid the ferocity of the Battle of Isurava, acts of extraordinary heroism stood out, epitomizing the courage and determination of the Australian soldiers. One of the most notable heroes was Private Bruce Kingsbury of the 2nd 14th Battalion. During a critical moment in the battle, when the Japanese threatened to overrun the Australian positions, Kingsbury seized a Bren gun and charged the enemy lines. With sheer audacity and fearless resolve, Kingsbury single-handedly cleared a path through the attacking Japanese, inflicting heavy casualties and providing a much-needed boost to his beleaguered comrades. His actions momentarily halted the Japanese advance and allowed the Australians to regroup. Tragically, Kingsbury was killed by a sniper shortly after his courageous assault, but his bravery earned him a posthumous Victoria Cross, Australia's highest military honour. The Battle of Isurava marked a pivotal turning point in the Kokoda Trail campaign. Although the Australians were eventually forced to withdraw from Isurava, their tenacious defence inflicted severe losses on the Japanese forces and significantly slowed their advance. The battle demonstrated the Australians' ability to stand up to the Japanese onslaught, boosting morale and proving that the tide could be turned. Moreover, the battle set the stage for the subsequent Australian counteroffensive. The delay and attrition suffered by the Japanese at Isurava allowed the Allies to bring in additional reinforcements and supplies, strengthening their position along the Kokoda Trail. The determination and bravery displayed at Isurava galvanized the Australian troops and underscored the importance of holding the line against the Japanese advance. Ultimately, the Battle of Isurava marked the beginning of a shift in momentum towards the Allies in the Kokoda Trail campaign, laying the groundwork for their eventual victory and the preservation of Port Moresby as a vital Allied stronghold in the Pacific. The challenging terrain of the Kokoda Trail posed significant logistical difficulties for both sides, but the Australians faced the monumental task of reinforcing and resupplying their forward positions. The trail was narrow, muddy, and steep, making it extremely difficult to transport troops, weapons, and provisions. Despite these challenges, the Australian High Command was determined to bolster their frontline units. Reinforcements from the battle-hardened 7th Division, including the 21st and 25th Brigades, were dispatched to the front. These soldiers had gained invaluable experience in the Middle Eastern campaigns and were crucial in strengthening the Australian defence. Supplies were carried by native Papuan carriers known as the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels, who played a vital role in keeping the troops fed and equipped. These carriers braved the harsh conditions, often under fire, to deliver much-needed ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The logistics of resupplying the front lines required meticulous planning and coordination. Airdrops were also utilized, though the dense jungle canopy and unpredictable weather made this method risky. The determination and ingenuity of the Australian forces in overcoming these logistical hurdles were instrumental in maintaining their fighting capability along the Kokoda Trail. With reinforcements in place and supply lines established, the Australians began planning their counteroffensive to reclaim the territory lost to the Japanese. The strategy involved a series of coordinated attacks designed to push the Japanese back along the Kokoda Trail and regain control of strategic positions. One of the key battles in this counteroffensive was the Battle of Brigade Hill, which took place in early September 1942. The Australians aimed to surprise the Japanese by attacking their rear positions, cutting off their supply lines, and encircling their forces. Despite fierce resistance, the Australian troops managed to inflict significant casualties and disrupt the Japanese advance. The counteroffensive continued with battles at Isurava Ridge and Templeton's Crossing, where the Australians utilized their knowledge of the terrain and guerrilla tactics to gain the upper hand. These engagements were marked by intense jungle warfare, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The Australians' ability to coordinate their attacks and maintain pressure on the retreating Japanese forces gradually shifted the momentum in their favor. As the Australians advanced, the Japanese defensive efforts became more desperate. They constructed makeshift fortifications, laid ambushes, and conducted delaying actions to slow the Australian advance. The harsh jungle conditions, combined with supply shortages and disease, took a heavy toll on the Japanese troops. Despite these challenges, they continued to fight with determination, knowing that their mission to capture Port Moresby was critical to their strategic goals in the Pacific. The resilience of the Japanese forces, however, could not indefinitely withstand the sustained Australian counteroffensive. Gradually, the Australians reclaimed key positions along the trail, pushing the Japanese back towards their starting point. With the tide of the battle beginning to turn, the Australians launched a relentless pursuit to reclaim the ground lost to the Japanese. The reinvigorated Australian forces, bolstered by reinforcements and resupplied despite the challenging terrain, embarked on a determined advance along the Kokoda Trail. Each step forward was fiercely contested by the Japanese, who had established strong defensive positions. The Australians employed a combination of frontal assaults and flanking maneuvers, using their knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver the Japanese and regain control of strategic points. Battles at Templeton's Crossing, Eora Creek, and Oivi Gorari were marked by intense combat, with the Australians gradually gaining the upper hand through superior tactics and relentless pressure. As the Australians advanced, the Japanese forces faced mounting hardships. The grueling retreat through the unforgiving jungle took a severe toll on the already exhausted soldiers. Supply lines, stretched thin and constantly harassed by Australian attacks, failed to deliver the necessary food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Malnutrition and disease, particularly malaria and dysentery, ravaged the ranks, further weakening their fighting capability. The morale of the Japanese troops began to waver as the reality of their situation became clear. The initial momentum they had gained was lost in the face of the Australians' relentless pursuit and the harsh conditions of the trail. The lack of adequate medical care and the relentless pressure from the advancing Australians left the Japanese in a dire situation, struggling to maintain cohesion and combat effectiveness. Recognizing the untenable position, the Japanese High Command made the strategic decision to withdraw their forces from the Kokoda Trail. General Tomitaro Horii, understanding that continued resistance would only lead to greater losses, ordered a retreat towards the northern coast. The goal was to regroup and fortify positions in areas where they could better sustain their defenses and maintain supply lines. The decision to withdraw was a significant turning point in the Kokoda campaign. For the Japanese, it marked the end of their ambitious push towards Port Moresby and a recognition of the limits of their operational reach in the face of determined Australian resistance. The strategic withdrawal allowed them to preserve what remained of their fighting force for future operations, albeit at a considerable loss in terms of territory and morale. For the Australians, the Japanese withdrawal was a hard-earned victory. It underscored the effectiveness of their strategy and the resilience of their soldiers in overcoming seemingly insurmountable odds. The recapture of the Kokoda Trail not only secured Port Moresby, but also marked a pivotal shift in the Pacific theater, demonstrating that the Japanese advance could be halted and reversed. The campaign's outcome bolstered Allied confidence and set the stage for subsequent offensives that would eventually lead to Japan's retreat across the Pacific. If you would like to see more videos like this, then please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time.